Hello again, everybody. Welcome back this afternoon for our afternoon presentation from EAB. Welcome to the branch campuses, Charlotte, Denver, North Miami. We hope you're able to hear us okay. We know that we have provided an opportunity for you to ask questions during the presentation. Also Harborside culinary faculty, anybody else that's down at the Harborside campus. We want you to be as much a part of this presentation as those of us who are sitting in the auditorium. Okay, now it's my pleasure to welcome Matthew Pellish, Managing Director of Strategic Research and Education for the Education Advisory Board, better known as EAB. This organization collaborates with education leaders, practitioners, and staff to accelerate progress and drive results, helping schools support students from enrollment to graduation and beyond. His presentation, State of the Union, Preparing for the Volatile Decade Ahead, will cover the challenges and opportunities in the higher education arena and what we can expect from this generation of students. Matt developed a passion for education while an undergraduate student at St. Joseph's University in Philadelphia, where he earned bachelor's degrees in English and political science. His passion expanded early in his career in roles as Director of Continuing Education, Special Assistant to the President, and Head of New Program Development at several universities and colleges in the Northeast. He earned a master's degree in education from Harvard University Graduate School of Education, where he specialized in higher education management, organizational design, and leadership. Matt's current emphasis on executive communication strategy brings his expertise of industry trends, opportunities, and threats to the forefront of institutional and system operations and policy. He has facilitated nearly 1,000 presentations at hundreds of member campuses and districts on a variety of topics. We are thankful to have him here with us today. Matt, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ben. Right now? How about now? Oh, there we go. Much better. Applause for that one, please. So, good start. So I know that you're about a little less than a week away from the start of undergrads coming back on campus, and you're all getting prepared for when some of your students file into the room and will start from the back and the sides and slowly fill in their seats forward, kind of like this in a lot of ways, is usually what happens. It's sort of an interesting social dynamic of what happens in the classroom setting. But as we go through this today, I've got about an hour to 90 minutes of great research content I want to share with you here this afternoon. As we go through this, though, I want to hear from you all. We're going to talk about some of the major trends that I've been hearing and our research teams at EAB have been hearing over the last year. And you'll see some things in there that will be applicable here at Johnson & Wales. There'll be some things applicable to your own students. There'll be a lot of these very high-level trends, but I want to hear about it. I want to hear questions, comments, reactions to this. Because for me, this has been a very interesting year and a half of research where we've been talking to presidents and chancellors, we've been talking to provosts, we've been talking to vice presidents of student affairs, deans, department chairs, faculty, students, everybody about what they are preparing for the future of higher education. And my goal is to give you about a 90-minute overview of everything going on that is a major concern, opportunity, threat for our entire colleges and universities in the country. So as I go through this, I'll move pretty quickly through a lot of material. I'll say that the PowerPoint slides I've drawn and that I have behind me, I always give this as a little bit of a caveat. If you were sitting in your seats and you pulled out your smartphone and you Googled how to draw a PowerPoint slide, I've probably broken almost every single one of those rules that you would see out there, because these are meant to be takeaways. These are meant for you to have afterwards as research documents, as reference pieces if you want to ever go read through some more of this. So we will send them all out to you digitally, or can send you a physical copy if you like as well. So don't think you have to take it all in, or I've put so many small fine prints on there that you'll be able to read any of it in some cases of what we talk about. We'll use those as a little bit of takeaways. Diving into this a bit though, what we decided to title a bit of our industry overview this year was Preparing for the Volatile Decade Ahead. And that was very interesting because what we found are that many colleges and universities were saying, we might be doing okay today, we might be doing okay for a year or 2 years or 3 years, but we're getting a little bit worried about what 10 years is going to look like for higher education. And that was actually very encouraging, because most schools I talk to don't necessarily plan in 10-year timeframes. We usually think in a much shorter time frame in higher education. And yet there was a lot of this reaction from schools saying, we need to be thinking a little bit further out. And so what I want to share with you is what they were talking about, what everybody was asking about, what they were thinking about. And I always start with basically 3 areas we're going to cover here today. The first one we're going to talk about is the challenge of, will our business model survive? And this comes up a lot in higher education. A lot of schools wonder, will we be here in the same way as we are today in 10 years or so? And we got a lot of these types of quotes, but I got this one. The competitive landscape has never been more challenging, both in traditional and new markets. And it was this interesting idea about where students select to go to school, and how we're recruiting students, and how we're offering programs, and just how complex the competition for different schools became. So that was one. Number 2, we're going to talk about the student of the future. This has probably been my favorite area to hear discussions, to talk about students currently in the classroom, students who are in high school or elementary school, non-traditional students. What will the student body look like in about 10 years? What will they expect from their college or university experience? 10 years from now, what will a student expect of Johnson & Wales? And we go back and we look at a little bit of their preferences. But I heard this over and over again. We're not prepared for how students' needs and preferences are rapidly evolving. That they are coming to hold colleges and universities to very high standards, kind of in a different way than we've ever heard of before. And I'll share what that looks like. And lastly, I want to talk about the crisis of confidence in higher education. And this is a lot about perception. This is a lot about what we hear from both the public, from the private sector, that perception has never been so negative from all directions. And that's this constant critique against colleges and universities. And I want to talk about what that looks like and why that's come about. But we'll dive into each one of these, give you a little bit of the context. And like I said, at any point, if you have questions, we have microphones. If you have questions from the other campuses, I know we have a system for you to sort of text those in, and we can ask them as well. And I will pull up at various points to hear some questions as well as we go through. I always start, though, with that question of, will our business model survive? And I go to the first part, which is some survey data. This is a little survey instrument that's done every year by Inside Higher Ed and Gallup. And they are actually surveying university presidents and university chancellors. And this is the response from those presidents and chancellors about how strongly they agree with the business model from their institution will be sustainable for the next 10 years. So it's basically which ones feel they will be here and they will be sustainable for 10 years' time. What you always find up there at the top, the elite private universities, top-ranked institutions in the country, names you all hear about, always feel really good, right? 93% feel like they will be here pretty much exactly as they are 10 years out. Next category down, your elite private liberal arts colleges. Again, you've usually got name recognition, you've got very strong endowments, you've got pools of students wanting to go to those institutions, also feel very strongly about what they'll look like in 10 years. Next category down, public flagships. Our largest flagship state institutions feel pretty confident. And after this past weekend, they got a whole lot of free marketing, if anybody had turned the TV on at any point. They often get that is a huge driver and a huge force for public institutions. And then from there, it kind of falls off. This is where it gets concerning, because those top 3 categories are not that many schools. It's a relatively small absolute number of schools that hit those categories. Everywhere else starts to feel a lot less confident. What I think was kind of fascinating here is that community colleges are actually above non-flagship publics and other privates here in all categories. But even community colleges, maybe a lower price point, maybe a different connection to the community, you feel stronger about this. But the low response here from presidents and chancellors, who usually have the strongest and most positive view of the future, are telling us that there's a worry about what's going to happen in the next 10 years. That's our starting point, right, if we think about that. But why is it the case? And this is always the good data point to start with. These are the enrollment trends in colleges and universities going back to about the mid-1980s up until our sort of modern year here. And what you see is just very strong growth in enrollments in higher education. You go back here and you see we actually hit this very high peak post-secondary point there in 2010. Many of you have seen some of this data before. We were about 21 million students enrolled in colleges and universities in the country. Problem for many is that after that point, it starts to go down. We actually started to see declines in our overall enrollments from 2010 to where we are today. And if you look at the lines we've got here in the chart, that top orange line, that's the undergraduate students. That's the one that's going down. It's actually our undergraduates that are on a downward enrollment trend. Your blue bar that you have down there at the bottom, that's your graduate students, which have actually continued to increase, but at a much smaller number and a much smaller percentage in terms of what you look at there. So even where we're sitting right now, we've been on about an almost 10-year downward trend of student enrollments in higher education, which many say that's the foundation of our business, that's the foundation of our model, that's the foundation of what runs the university and what we do here. If that's where we are today, what are we expecting for the next 10 years? And that's where the concern gets a little bit more interesting, I think. Anybody ever seen this chart before? Something similar to this? This is the 18-year-old population in the country and the projections of the 18-year-olds that we're going to see. Now, we start over on the left-hand side. This is 2017. And we are right in the middle of this sort of up and down period of the 18-year-olds, but remaining pretty flat in terms of numbers. You then have this middle section right here. This is 2022 to 2025. And this is actually a very positive time frame. We're going to actually see an 8% increase in 18-year-olds across that 3-year time period. And many schools are saying, that's good, right? From an enrollment perspective, from a recruitment perspective for our institutions, that's positive. We can recruit those students. Right up until about 2026. And if anybody's seen this data, this is what has now been termed the demographic cliff of 18-year-olds in the country, where quite literally you have a 14% decrease in the 18-year-old population from 2026 out to 2029. That's actually 650,000 fewer 18-year-olds in 2029 than there were in 2026. If you want that number to sink in, that's a lot of 18-year-olds. That's a lot of students. Now, the reason I'm sort of hammering this home is this may be one of the most important charts that is going to guide higher education for the next decade. This is going to guide a lot of recruitment patterns. This is going to be guiding a lot of enrollments. And what I think concerns me more than anything else is this middle period. It's not the cliff. I think most people have talked about that. Most people have looked at it a little bit. It's actually the middle period where I worry a lot of schools are going to feel okay, right? They're going to feel good. They're going to say, well, we're hitting our enrollment numbers. Or maybe we're going up a little bit in terms of our enrollments. And they're not necessarily preparing for what happens in 2026, when that number just drops off pretty precipitously. That's the concern that we're looking at here. And I've done a lot of sessions on this. I've talked to a lot of people about it. We've looked at all the numbers on it. And you think about this, it makes total sense. This is not shocking. This didn't come out of nowhere. Because what happened 18 years before 2026? Shout it out. Financial crisis, economic downturn, Great Recession, right? Right around 2007, 2008. Parents, families, people decided to have fewer children or not have kids at all. They made a bit of a financial decision about whether or not to have more kids or any kids. And you actually start to see the fertility rate, that's the birth rate, continues to go down even after 2029. Now, I've been in a lot of sessions, people say, what can we do to fix this? It is my favorite question. It remains my favorite question of the last few years. You can't fix this, right? This is not going to get fixed. You can't go back. I wish there were a DeLorean and you could go back in time and fix this and change the financial crisis. You can't, right? It's more about how do you prepare for it. What do you do to respond to this? Because this is the reality of demographics. You can't fix it. You can't go back. This is not going to happen that way. It's more of this is what's going to happen, just based upon numbers, based upon demographics, based upon population statistics. This is what we're looking at. Now, you have campuses in various locations, right? You have people all over the country, you have different schools all over the country. It doesn't feel the same everywhere. That is an important thing to note, that it's very local and regional in nature. So it depends where you are. But realistically, even in your own campuses, only one campus is in an area in a state that's actually going to experience growth out to about 2029, and that's Colorado. Right? If you're out in the Denver area, Colorado area, that's experiencing growth. If you look at these states, right, this is the map of the country, this is the projected change in the 18-year-old population, and this is the percentage change in the 18-year-old population by state. You've got 2 states that will experience greater than 10% growth. Those are the orange states that you have here on the map. Those 2 orange states are Idaho and Montana, okay? Now, in many cases, people would say, well, we go to the growth areas and we try to pull students out of those areas. I would say if your enrollment strategy at Johnson & Wales is to go to Idaho and Montana and pull the population out of there, it's probably not going to work, right? The absolute number there is very small. Percentage growth looks better, but the absolute number is still very small in those states. The only other growth areas that you have are the lighter gray. You've got Wyoming, Colorado, Oklahoma, Texas, Minnesota as the growth areas. And I would say pretty clearly from everybody we've talked to that everybody's already gone there. Everybody's already gone to go pull the students out of there. We work with a large number of schools in Texas who constantly say, please get out of Texas for all of this, because there are enrollment managers, there are enrollment stations, all of those throughout the state of Texas, because it's been growing for a while. Those are the growth areas that we see. Pretty much everywhere else is on a decline. And it's particularly felt the hardest right where we are in New England, or the Mid-Atlantic, or the Midwest. That's where we see the most intense decline of the 18-year-old population out to that time frame. When you think about that, that's what we're projected to look at. This is not, again, things you can change. These are the projections that everyone's looking at to this time point. It's not the rosy picture from an enrollment perspective, but it's the reality of what we need to respond to, or we have to think about when it comes to the next 10 years in higher education. I always like to pull up here thoughts or reactions to this as you sit here in Rhode Island, or you think about the branch campuses in North Carolina, out in Colorado, down in Florida. When you think about these numbers, you think about your own internal conversations or planning, what are some of the questions you have, reactions you have when you look at this kind of data, this kind of chart? Yeah, please.
There will also be more jobs.
There will be more jobs. In terms of what sense?
Like, if there's going to be less people, period, then there's going to be more jobs.
Well, I can't predict that. That's one of the things that comes up a lot in our conversations. The question is, what will jobs look like of the future? I don't have the crystal ball on what artificial intelligence will do. I don't know what job displacement will do. I don't know what replacement will do. I don't know. There's a belief that there will be more jobs. There's the boomer retirements that also people say will bring more jobs to different levels. Well, are we preparing students for those jobs is the next question. Are you set up for those industries that are going to grow across that time frame or in the next 15, 20 years? I don't have the crystal ball. If I did, I'd invest heavily on something and no longer do this. But I don't know. It's a good idea. I just don't know. I don't think anyone has the crystal ball on it. Yeah. Please, yeah.
Thank you. It seems there's about 30 to 40, you can check on that information or accuracy, but I understand there's about 30 to 40% of the population in our country who gets a 4-year degree. So there is, huge room for growth in terms of people perhaps who have not perceived a need for a degree. And my question then is sort of, do you see higher ed leadership moving to sort of imagine how they can engage with that 60%? And then also, how much do you tie the sort of trends in our culture to some of these profiles that you see, or declining enrollment overall?
What I would look at is, yeah, we'll repeat that one. So the question is a little bit about the, college attainment rate, or the bachelor's degree attainment rate. It hovers, I think it's around the 30s, but it might be 30 or 40% or so. I don't know the exact statistic, but we'll go with that. And I think the question is a little bit about more maybe access in some cases, of increasing access to higher education, not only for students out of high school, but also those that maybe have never gone to college, or have gone to college and maybe gotten some credit, but never gotten a degree. So we'd say degree completion as another category there. What I would say on just the college access question is that we have seen a dramatic increase in access to college and universities going back to the 1970s. where we just have seen it sort of skyrocket in terms of the student enrollments going up and access going up. Completion has remained pretty flat, though, which is that as we continue to enroll more and more students, it took more and more resources to support those students. It took more and more resources to get them through to graduation. And even then, we didn't really see the dial turn too much or the numbers go up significantly, which actually leads to our last point, which goes to the crisis of confidence or the critiques of higher education. You've enrolled more students for the last 40 plus years, but you haven't necessarily graduated a higher percentage of those students that came in. Most would say we've maybe topped out. People say maybe we hit the ceiling on what we could get from a percent access point on students coming to college or university. And enrollment managers will tell us that a lot, that we don't know if there's a population that we could go after, that we could work with to try to increase access in a tremendous way that would overcome this. It might help it, and we could do a bit of it, but I don't know if it would overcome it. On the student side, on those that don't have a college degree, in some cases we would look at that of what are they looking for? We'd say, are they going to go back and get a bachelor's degree? Are they mid-career professionals looking to, say, maybe make a switch from one profession or career to another? Do they want a full 4-year degree, or do they want some kind of short format credential? Do they want a boot camp? Do they want a certificate? Do they want something that's going to get them the promotion next, or going to have a direct connection in terms of skills and competencies? And they're very price sensitive, right? They're very cautious and cognizant of how much it costs to go to school. So a little harder to recruit those students. The statistic I love, and we have it in here, I'll talk about it a bit, there's about 31 million people in this country that have some college credit but no degree, right? 31 million is a rather tremendously large number. But a very small portion of that, only about 4 million of those students, have about 2 years progress towards a degree, meaning they got an associate's degree and now could go for a bachelor's degree completion type of program. Other students have sort of collected credits across the course of a lifetime and don't really have progress towards a degree. Some are one-term stop-outs. They came once and have never come back in the last 50 years. It's hard to go after those students again. There's such a small portion of them that actually might come for degree completion. So a bit of a long-winded answer, but that's all, when you add the statistics, the data about those student populations, it's not any easier. It's not something everyone's running towards saying this is the fix that we can go towards. Okay. Other questions, thoughts? Okay. To your point, we'll launch off of here, which is a question of access. It's a question of, okay, we know what the demographics tell us. We know what the number of 18-year-olds will look like. What about trying to predict the likelihood they'll go to school? Right? So there's always the question of, will they go to college, university? If they go, will they go to a 4-year? Will they go to a 2-year? Will they go to an elite institution? Will they go to a public, to a private? It's that big question about how do you dive into a little bit more. And there's actually a lot of articles that have been written about this, about what will the future look like. And there was this article actually from a little over a year ago that started to talk about it from the Wall Street Journal. And it was just such a very clear message of what people were discussing here. US colleges are separating into winners and losers. And this article goes on to show and say that the highest ranked institutions, the institutions with the greatest financial outcomes after graduation, the lowest default rates, will only do better. They'll continue to recruit students because they'll have name recognition, they'll have great quantitative outcomes, and the schools that are not doing as well, say you have a lower graduation rate, a lower starting salary after graduation, a higher default rate, those will actually prevent you from being able to recruit students into the future. And it starts to break all this out and say, what will that pattern look like? After that, we actually saw a bit of a book here. If you want a good read for your last week before students come back, this is Demographics and the Demand for Higher Education over on the right. This is written by Nathan Gras out of Carleton College in Minnesota. He's sort of a labor statistician, went in and started to say, okay, based upon historical trends, if we look at data, if we look at students, if we look at them by zip code, if we look at them by race and ethnicity, by GPA, by family earning, can we look at trends to think of what they will do in the next 10 years, or the likelihood that a certain type of student will go to a certain type of institution? And if we take all of the demographic data, can we project what that likelihood will look like for the next 10 years? And he put together what's called this higher ed demand index that actually goes in and shows statistically if all of those models, if everything historically held, what would it look like for the next 10 years? And what he found is there's actually a 9% decline in 4-year college-bound students out to 2029 because of the way that they're likely to go to school. And what was interesting to us is as you broke this down further, he started to actually segment institutions. in different ways to try to show where students would go and what institutions could expect. And I'm basically taking a pretty complex data-based book here about all these demographics and distilling it down into one slide to try to give you a little bit of this in the time we have today. But he basically went through and said, if we take the elite higher education institutions over on the left, and he used US News and World Reports. So if you take the top 50 research universities, the top 50 liberal arts colleges, that's what he used as the elite category here. And we can debate US News and World Reports, their methodology, everything about them, but that's what he used as the baseline here. Saying, well, students, families still use US News and World Reports a whole lot when they're starting to compare institutions. In that elite category, what he actually projects is that there's an 8% increase in demand for elite institutions. And it's a bit of that strong only gets stronger argument. That the elite institutions, strong reputation, demand will increase for the most elite institutions in the country. The next category is national higher education institutions. This is the next 50 in each category. 50 to 100 research, 50 to 100 liberal arts colleges. Even in that category, these are some very reputable institutions. These are institutions with strong endowments and programs and alumni networks and connections. Even there's a projected decline in demand, just based on the demographics, based on the trends that you see. The last category, this is the regional higher education institutions. This is basically everybody else in the entire country. If you're not in that top 100 set of those particular categories, everybody else falls in the regional category, and that's where there's the more dramatic and the largest decline in terms of demand. The overall demand will continue to decline for most of these categories, most institutions, based upon the historical trends for students. Now, I'll say a couple things about this. When you look at it, there's what's called spillover effect, which is that all of the students that want to go to the very elite institutions won't get in, right? Unless Harvard, Princeton, Yale, Columbia, Stanford, MIT, if they all start opening up a lot of seats and start drastically growing their classes, those students are going to look for somewhere else to go because they're not all going to get in, which means that actually the national category may experience some spillover effect of students who actually attend those institutions. That spillover effect statistically doesn't hold from the national to the regional category. There's not enough students to spill over to overcome what would be the declines you see there. The other thing is this is not destiny. It's not written in stone. This doesn't have to happen. Anything could change. Changes to policy, changes to access, changes in what students decide to do could change this whole model. It's based off of historically what has been seen, what is likely to happen if that were to hold as a model. But we use this to say that it's not the rosiest picture, again, when it comes to competition, when it comes to enrollments. And as we think about institutions in the country, it's the question of what it will be from a competition perspective. Competition, I mentioned that was sort of a big driver of the business model challenge, of the challenge of higher education. Well, privates already have a lot of different competition. Right? You have competition from community colleges and two-year institutions. You certainly have competition from public institutions. You have competition from other privates, selective privates, other regional privates, everybody else in the country. And what I think was interesting is when that competition came out as a discussion with enrollment managers this year, they said a new competitor for them was workforce entry, which we'd heard a little bit about before, but I never heard people be able to quantify it. And we saw enrollment managers tell us when the economy is as good as it is right now and the unemployment rate is as low as it is right now, there's a lot of 18-year-olds coming out of high school saying, I can go into a skilled trade, I can go and I can get a pretty decent wage right out of high school, rather than going out and taking debt to go to college or university. And we actually saw a lot of enrollment managers tell us the hardest to recruit population is 18-year-old male students, because many of them are choosing to go into skilled trades, and they saw their numbers drop pretty significantly when it came to recruitment. So workforce is another consideration in terms of competition there. This, again, is the world as it was described to us. When planning for the future, when thinking about where we sit today, how competition is only going to intensify. That if this is what it looks like now, and all of these projections for the next 10 years show us this demographic downturn and these challenges, we need to be thinking about how to react to it. You already mentioned this. This is just, again, the statistics of the degree completers. So many will say, well, let's look to degree completion. All right, you mentioned it. This is a good point of it. This is basically how it breaks out. That 31 million students broken out in terms of the potential completers, and those that have usually an associate's degree, 2 years of progress, often can come in and complete a bachelor's degree. It's only about 12.5% up there in the blue at the top. As I mentioned, those that have enrolled for one term and never come back is about 32% of that 31 million. And they may have enrolled for one term back in the 1970s and never come back. Right? They're still put in that category. And the biggest one, almost 56%, multiple term enrollees with less than 2 years progress towards a degree. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't work with these students. I'm not saying that it's something that we shouldn't explore and work with and have those students come in, but they're very price sensitive as well. Right? They're usually very cognizant of what the cost is. They're usually bringing a lot of different things in terms of credit to the table, meaning they're going to come to your admissions office, your registrar's office, to your academic departments and say, okay, I've got some AP credits, I've got some dual enrollment credits, I've got some community college credits, I've got some online credits from somewhere else, I went to Straighter Line and got some other credits, I went to University of Phoenix for a little while and got some credits, I've got all of this stuff. How does it fit towards a Johnson & Wales degree? And I want to do it as fast as possible and as low cost as possible. So can you figure that out for me? That's the reality of this student population. So it's not that easy that they're just going to show up and they're going to magically enroll in your programs and be streamlined into a degree and successful. The other one's international. I think we've heard a lot about international students. It's always been a foundation of many private institutions' budgets. A lot of privates who enroll a lot of international students as a foundation of tuition to come to the institution, enroll a significant student population. We would just say that if you look at some of the trends, we have seen a decline in international students in the United States starting right around 2016. And the data will tell you that, right? If you actually go and survey it, the applications went down, the yield went down, the enrollments went down, and it's related to US policy, it's concerns about the US presidential administration, it's actually concerns about safety, too, have come up from international students, not feeling safe in the United States. And you start to see that decline in terms of our international enrollments. Now that, everyone says, that could change with policy changes, but it's not, again, a very sound thing on which we can actually rely, or people know. We work with about 50 Canadian institutions at EAB, who have pretty much said, if the US policies could continue, that would be wonderful from an international perspective. Their biggest problem is, what do we do with all of these international students that are now enrolling at our institutions? They're trying to find dorms, they're trying to find housing, they're trying to find job placements, they're trying to figure out how to support them. So they have felt the exact opposite of what we've seen here in the US as that has gone down. So again, it's a student population we're not going to abandon, we're not going to do this anymore, but it's been on a decline since 2016. Which turns me to the other one. I think this is the one on which many schools have either already started, have been working for many years, or some are a little bit late in the game or are trying to get into it, and that's the online place. Online education and distance education and multimodal education. Maybe we'll say if we're looking at our local demographics, our regional demographics, we can go all over the country, we can have a national reach, and we can pull students from all over the place. And while that's a good strategy, it's something that can be done, there's always this bit of survey that's done every year by the Aslandian Market Research Group and Learning House, and it actually tracks the online students' distance from the institution from which they're taking their online courses and programs. And we always think it's going to be this huge national reach and everybody's going to have national students, and you have a few, but in reality what you have is about 67% of students live within 50 miles of the campus from which they're taking their online courses or programs. That gets even closer here, 44% live within 25 miles. So almost half of online students are very close to the institutions from which they're taking their online courses or programs. There's a very small number of schools. Southern New Hampshire is one of them. Liberty University is another one that does have a huge national reach, that does pull students from a broader base. But for the most part, it's still very local, very regional, even in the online marketplace. When students are recruiting, they're thinking about it, we wonder, why do you think that's the case? And we'd say there's a couple things that online students will say. They'll say, I like the ability to come to campus. I like to go meet with my faculty members, my professors. I like to go meet with students. I like to use campus services whenever I can. I like to be a part of a community. They'll also say, I like the connection you have to local employers. I like the reputation that you have in our local area, because that also, the connections, the relationships carries through. And the other one that I thought was interesting is they'll say, when I have a problem, I like to be able to come to campus if I need to fix it. Right? I don't want to just go online. I don't want to just go on the phone. I spend enough time on the phone with cable providers and banks and everybody else. I like to come to the registrar's office. Right? I like to come to the financial aid office. I like to go to the IT office if I have to. And I can't do that from one of these big national players. So there's still that local nature of online that I think holds pretty well here. What I'll jump to, and I think the statistics are what holds here, is what our enrollments have looked like because of online education. This is some data from about 2012 to about 2016 when we pulled it here. But what you're looking at is the change in student enrollments at four-year institutions. And you look at, in many cases, your overall enrollments staying pretty strong, but really it's done through online enrollments that have carried this through. Over on the far right-hand side, you actually see that purely face-to-face enrollments declined by about 7.5% across that time frame. It's either the multimodal, the hybrid types of courses, or online courses that have seen the growth, or have been the driver of growth in higher education. And if you break that out by undergraduate, graduate categories, that's where you actually see, again, more of this growth. Undergrads as well growing in the online space, but your graduate enrollment has grown by almost 30% through online or distance or multimodal education. Most would say that's going to hold out in the future as well. It's more of how do we go online, not whether we go online for a lot of schools. And you're already in that space, you're already moving online, you already have a lot of programs there, but this is, again, what many will see from the future. As we talk about student expectations, this is going to be something that they are going to come to expect. Right? They expect to use technology. They expect to have access in a different way. And this is a bit of what we say when we're looking at students, we're thinking about demographics. It's that distance education, multimodal education approach that is an important part of the model moving out into the future. Last part, and I'll pull up for some questions here, comes up a lot for us, which is, well, what about the industry from a consolidation perspective? I always think that word, it's very businessy, right? It's very kind of thinking about what will happen to us as a business. And I don't love to think about this, but we started to hear more and more questions about that from schools. What do we think about from the mergers and acquisitions, or M&A activity in higher education? And I'm no expert on M&A activity in any sector, but we started to go in and ask that question and see, could we actually track times where schools have either consolidated or systems have consolidated? And you started to see this in Wisconsin, you saw it in the state of Georgia, where the public systems went through and started to consolidate or merge different schools together, or actually connect 2- and 4-year institutions to each other in order to reduce the total size or meet their population needs. While it's been something people talk about, we haven't seen a massive uptick in it, quite frankly. It does happen, but on a relatively small scale. You'll even hear a lot of stories about schools that try to merge and fail, right? A lot of those, you see them in New England quite often, stories about them, where schools were trying to come together, but just couldn't make it work or had differences in terms of what they were going to consolidate or what they were going to do from an organizational side. So you don't see this massive type of merger of schools in the country. What you do see, though, are some of, we'd say, strategic approaches to it. And this has been many schools that have said, well, maybe I can buy part of a school or merge with part of an institution, or I can buy a specific type of an institution. And that's what you see some of the stories here. Strategic academic asset mergers and acquisitions is what it was termed as. And again, these very businessy terms that I don't love to use in this, but that's what they're thought of. So you see schools actually going out and buying a school for international students. You see them buying law schools in some cases if they don't have one. Health science schools in some cases if they don't have one. Certainly the one that touches close to home for me is I used to work at Wheelock College up in Boston. And when I saw BU acquire Wheelock only a short time ago, I had to say, like, that makes sense from a real estate perspective, right? I was looking at the programs. Yes, there's alignment of academic programs, of an education school, et cetera. At the same time, to have real estate that close to BU in Brookline up in Boston was a strategic asset for BU to acquire. That's what we started to see a lot more of, those sort of smaller pieces of acquisition in higher education. And the last one, I know you talked a little bit about this morning, is more of the question of closures. All right, we always hear a good quote from Clay Christensen at Harvard Business School. 50% of the 4,000 colleges in the US will be bankrupt in the next 10 to 15 years. That's one of my favorite quotes, throws it out all the time. We have gone back and seen about 500 different closures since 2000. So in the last almost 20 years, about 500 schools have closed. And I know you talked about which schools are closing, but when you really break out the statistics, about 60% of them have been 2-year institutions. About 75% of them are for-profits that have actually closed. So it's not that every single private 4-year institution in the country is going out of business and closing its doors. It happens. It happens more frequently in New England, quite frankly, when you look at the trends geographically, but also in the Midwest. And that's what we're starting to look at from the closure perspective. I think there will be more closures on the horizon. It's going to happen for some schools because of everything we just talked about, because of the challenges of students, the challenges of competition, everything going on out there. This is going to continue to happen. I don't think everyone's going out of business, right? I don't see some mass consolidation like we see in the banking industry or you see in other industries in higher education. Don't see that on the near horizon. But there will be some closures. There will be things to prepare or think about or be prepared to sort of combat in many ways as an institution. This is, again, basically the way the business model, the questions of the future were laid out for us from that sustainability argument from college and universities. But I'd love to pull up here for questions, comments, reactions to this when you think about what we covered here at Johnson & Wales, or just general questions about what we discussed so far. I know we have microphones we can run around if people have questions that we can, or I can repeat them as well. Questions, thoughts, reactions? In the back there, you might have to shout it out, but.
Great presentation. You've done a lot of good work with trends and demographics. As we all know, demographics are a good way to predict things, but the future is fundamentally unknowable.
Mm-hmm.
Do is look at the future exhibitions and World's Fairs, and then let me check it out 15 years later. The thing that I'm worried about here is AI, and more importantly, deep learning, which is going on. In other words, what's happening, as we all know, is that artificial intelligence is starting to come into most jobs, and what's even scarier is that computers are being taught to learn. Well, how long will it be before so many jobs that we're referring to and so many approaches that we're talking about are going to be followed out? I was particularly interested in when you said the workforce aspect, and you mentioning the trades and apprenticeships, and so on, stuff that's going on in Germany. And I'm wondering if we're kind of using almost the wrong terms here, talking about higher education, thinking of our current paradigm, and maybe we should be thinking more about all sorts of ways of proceeding through life with AI, with computers that are very smart, with jobs changing a lot, and maybe the form of education that's going to be most popular in the future is going to be people going to work, apprenticeships, things like that, and periodically getting a 5-week or a 6-month something along the way to take them into the future. I'm talking like 10 years from now.
Yeah, I'll repeat sort of as quickly as short, to paraphrase a little bit what you said. Sort of the question of the impact of computers, the impact of AI in terms of not only industries and jobs and skilled trades and humans versus computers, but how that may be a paradigm shift for higher education and maybe a movement away from a 4-year degree or a 2-year or 3-year degree to something that we'd say is more short format at various points along a career path, something along those lines. We've seen it, right? We've started to see institutions moving in that direction. I was saying if we have a decline in terms of our traditional credentials or our traditional education, there may be an opportunity for us to do a 5-week boot camp or a 5-week certificate or a coding boot camp that I can go and I can get a specific skill in a specific time. There's a lot of questions about it though, because some people say that you still need what's called a T-shaped professional. Has anybody ever heard that term, T-shaped professional, before? Go Google it. It's a way of thinking about the well-rounded individual, which is this idea of a T-top, which are broad-based skills, liberal arts type skills, communication, logic, reasoning, leadership, etc. And then the T-stem, which is a very specific skill. So the idea is I've got broad skills and then maybe I can code in Python. Or I've got broad-based skills and maybe I'm social media marketing communication specialist. Right, just to give you examples. And a lot of the argument is that's more of the wave of the future, which is education may be trying to provide a foundation one way or another, either the T-top or the T-stem, and then lifelong learning, so this constant cycle of movement in and out of college and university will go to round out the T. Maybe you need some of those leadership skills because you focus so heavily on computer science and artificial intelligence that you actually can't work in a team or work in a certain environment. So there's a lot of those arguments that we move towards what's known as the knowledge economy, that it's knowledge of systems and processes and adaptation and learning across a lifestyle and lifetime that may be the future of this. And the question is, are schools prepared for that? Now, I don't know if the whole industry is going to shift in that way. I don't know if it's going to be the destruction of higher education as we know it, but we have started to see more of your post-traditional, non-traditional students coming back and saying, I don't want a graduate degree. I want the short format thing that will get me a promotion or will get me the job that I see opening up or will prepare me for when AI displaces my job. So that's a little bit of what we've seen. Again, you're right, the future is unpredictable in many ways of what it will look like. I think we should have flying cars, right? I grew up in the Back to the Future days. Like I expected something very different by this time many years ago. And we don't have that, so who knows? Yeah. I'm not a crystal ball, I'm not clairvoyant enough. Other questions? Yeah, please. It's social media influencer, in case you want to make it very specific.
They may have to make change. So do we know anything about the psychology behind it?
The question is about the 18-year-olds, if we know anything about what 18-year-olds are thinking. But specifically what they're thinking about jobs, what they're thinking about careers, et cetera. The best insight I got to that is working with K-12 counselors in K-12 public systems, as well as other schools, who've said the thing that comes out most often is what they see. And they said the one that they'll use, I kind of joke, social media influencer, which is YouTube star, Instagram, sort of that kind of thing. It is on the minds of almost all students that they're going to be the social media influencer of their generation. There's the other ones that come up a lot. Is it unboxing, right? I had to go Google that one because I had no idea that you watch someone else open up gifts. This is blowing my mind. But what was interesting is when you talk to a lot in high schools, they say it's not different in types of psychology. It's what you see in the world around you that gives you an idea of what opportunities are there for jobs. It used to be everybody wanted to be a professional athlete, a professional sports star, or everyone wanted to be a TV or a movie star. It's just that as media changes a bit, the sphere of what that is starts to change as well. It's that your view, your worldview, your idea of what opportunities are out there is somewhat narrow, no matter what 18-year-old you are today or 20 or 30 or 40 years ago. So getting into the mindset of what they think about job-wise, it's not that different. It's just that we've seen a bit more focus on exploration and career exploration earlier and earlier. There are many states in the country that as a part of their, what is known as the Every Student Succeeds Act plans, have to do career exploration as early as 6th grade, 3rd grade. And they're starting to incorporate careers and thinking about that exploration even more than ever before. So I don't think it's too different. I don't pretend to understand the psychology of 18-year-olds or be an expert in any way, shape, or form. But I can't say it's terribly different. It's just a different field or different opportunities or different things they see in their worldview that become jobs or opportunities. Kathy, question? Or? Oh, sure. Yeah, please. You right? Hi. Oh, I'm sorry, one more time.
Is the data disaggregated by type of program, or are all programs experiencing that same decline? Are some, increasing but being absorbed into their category?
Well, it depends how you break it out. Quite frankly, on a very general scale, the question was what programs, or how do you see this on a program level? Are all programs seeing a decline? No, health sciences is actually seeing a continual increase in a demand for health science or health-based programs. There are some, but not all, technology fields or engineering fields that have continued to see increases, but it's a relatively small absolute number as well that succeed in engineering. So while engineering enrollments might be up at some schools, it doesn't necessarily mean completions are increasing in a lot of those programs. If you look more social sciences, humanities, liberal arts generally have been on a decline for some time. Education, social work, decline for some time. So some of those have been on declines. It does break out program by program of what it looks like. Yeah, a question over here. Yeah, go ahead.
So not to discount the traditional college degree and career path that students pursue upon graduation, are you seeing anyone defining competitive advantage through the co-curriculum? Because it seems to me the kids we see today have a gap in socialization, and we're providing a service of socialization and engagement that is layered on top of the traditional degree program, and I don't see in discussion any focus on the co-curriculum and the socialization component as a competitive advantage. Seems to me it could be.
The way I've been answering that or thinking about it is it's hard to quantify, is the truth to it, is that many schools will say, well, we do holistic development, we do co-curricular programs, we work on socialization, we build skills that are outside of the hard skills of a science or a technical field or something like that. The problem that I find is every school says they do it. And no one defines very well how they do it or what they do. They broadly allude to it in many ways. They broadly allude to it in conversations or in collateral or conversations. While I think it's extremely valuable, I don't think anyone's figured out exactly how to communicate that as a part of the value of a college degree or the value of what comes from this. And I think particularly as we get into thinking about the cost of education, how that's continued to rise, people are very critical of, well, if I'm paying this much, what job do I get? What is the salary of that job when I get it? What is the debt that I take out? It's become very much a financial-based argument. And so some of those curricular skills and things that are outside of the quantitative metrics of success in higher education are just kind of swept under the rug and not really concerned about in the same way. So I would say there are a couple, though. If you look at someone like Northeastern, right, just north of here, doubled down pretty hard on co-op programs and partnerships and the network, right? That's their vision of the future, is this network aspect to it for many ways. And for them, they've been doing quite well. Their programs are growing. They're seeing students move into that. But again, it's still very connected to the job, the co-op internship type of model to it, as opposed to, say, extracurricular or holistic development of students. So I haven't seen anybody use that as the prime competitive advantage. We'll take one more and then we'll move on a little bit. Go ahead.
Could you speak a little bit about how ethnicity figures into the growth that we'll see in the midpoint of the 2020s and then the dip that we'll see toward the end of that, particularly for Latinas and Latinos in this country and Asian Americans, where we're supposed to be seeing more growth from those populations? And then the second part of the question is university-based retirement communities. How does that figure into the conversation on growth in schools that offer those communities? Are they in fact growing or projected to grow?
Okay, let's use that as the jumping off point to the students of the future, because we'll go into just some of the characteristics, and I don't have it broken out by midpoint in terms of the 2029 beyond that as well. And it's also state by state. Again, you're getting very regional in nature, where the Hispanic Latino population, while growing in many cases, is not everywhere in the same way. So it depends what it looks like. So these are just some statistics that he put out, projected to go out in the future. And this is overall a couple different things. One is a decline in terms of, we say, high-income households. These would be students from households making more than $100,000. And you're looking, again, out to about 2029. But there's a 10% decline there. There's a 20% decline in non-Hispanic white 18-year-olds, while there's a bit of, again, the growth in the Hispanic student population. There's also growth, as you mentioned, Asian American student population. Very small absolute number, though. So even in different states where it's growing, percentage-wise, seems to be growing. Absolute number is still pretty small in terms of the projections you have. And the other number that I think is important when you think about the differences of students is the 18-year-olds who would fall in, we say, the first generation student. And that's projected to be about 64% of college enrollments by 2029, meaning neither parent has a bachelor's degree. So there's all of those different variables. It's family income in terms of brackets there, it's race and ethnicity, it's things like first generation status. It creates a picture of a student that is a bit different than what has historically enrolled in higher education in the country. And that's where a lot of schools will say, if we look at what we're currently enrolling, if we look at what we've historically enrolled from a characteristic or a makeup of that student body, it doesn't look the same if we project out another 10 years. And the question is, will we be able to recruit those students? Will we support them, educate them, get them through to success? And not everybody's too sure of that yet, to be quite honest. And again, it's still very regional. I wish I could break out the map of what it looks like around the country, but you really need to dive in state by state, region by region to see what it looks like. Because it's assumed in many cases that the Hispanic student population is growing everywhere. It's not. It's actually not that strong in certain parts of the country as well. So kind of the jump off here of thinking about the students of the future. What I do go to a little bit, though, is how with all these students, affordability becomes a bit of a question. And that's particularly if you think about as a private institution, affordability continues to be one of these huge drivers and concern for students when selecting the school they're going to go to. If you actually, again, look at students, these are students thinking about list price. Right? They only understand and see list price. They see what's projected out there. They don't understand necessarily how financial aid works, how discounting works, how scholarships all work. We've got almost 70% of students have some or major concern about financing college. Almost 60% consider only list price. A lot of students will actually rule out a school before they even apply because of those numbers, because of those costs. And the more we see this change, it's how much that has become a part of the argument, how that's become a part of the debate in higher education. Because everyone points to this, and this is the growth in terms of tuition fees, room and board, coming out of the recession timeframe. It had been going up pretty significantly, dropped a bit obviously during the recession here, and then continued to skyrocket on the same trajectory it was before the recession. And that's why if you actually look at it, we read articles every day. Again, you can go back to 2012. The student loan crisis is crippling American families. 2015, student debt is worse than you think. 2018, student loan debt statistic, $1.5 trillion crisis. That's what students see. That's what students read. And then they see the list price of private institutions and think there's no way I could ever afford that. There's no way I could ever go to this particular institution. Not shockingly, when you actually look at the outcomes and the post-recession enrollments of different types of institutions, what you found here is, again, pre-recession, 2001 to 2007, overall percentage change in enrollment by institution type. And then the blue bars are 2010 to 2016, so post-recession enrollments. I always call out this regional and private category when you're considering and thinking about students, but leading up to the recession, 14% growth in enrollments. Saw that very strong growth. And then post-recession, only about 1% for that time frame. Again, families not only made decisions about whether or not they would have children, they also made a lot of very strategic decisions about where they would go to school based on cost because of the financial impact of the recession. What I think was interesting was you really looked at your most selective publics did even better coming out of the recession. Right? Public institutions realized, hey, we are a lower cost option. Everyone views us as a lower cost option because we're a public institution. And you started to see a lot of students, a massive increase in terms of applications to state flagship institutions around the country. As students said, there's reputation, there's recognition, there's low cost. And there's always that feeling that reputation, recognition, name recognition equals quality. Whether it does or not is a very different argument when you dive into completions and things like that. But from a financial perspective, it seems much less. And students are starting to compare what is the average cost, the average tuition and fees of different types of institutions. They're not drilling into discounting and how financial aid works. They're looking at those basic numbers over on the right-hand side, where privates come out to be the most expensive. What I always like to share, though, too, as you kind of go in and talk to students about this, is what does debt look like in the country? Because everyone says $1.5 trillion, right? It's the statistic everybody likes to quote because it's easy to quote it, and it's huge, right? That's a really big number to think there's $1.5 trillion in cumulative student loan debt in the country. But what I would say is you got to break it out a little bit because that $1.5 trillion is distributed amongst almost 45 million borrowers in the country. There's a lot of people that hold debt in the country. The average debt at graduation is about $28,000 across all different types of institutions there. As we talk to institutions, as we think about students, many people would say, that's not that much. Now, it's still debt, they'd say, but people would say, do we think of it as an investment? Do we think of it as a return on that education that you get? That your earning potential, your job potential, the things that you get out of that education go to overcome some of that. The other numbers I always like to share down at the bottom, this is the distribution of borrowers in the country. And what you actually find is almost 85% of borrowers owe less than $50,000. Of those 45 million students, of that $1.5 trillion, 85% owe less than $50,000. And this is including graduate student debt, this is including professional program debt, undergraduate, everything in that category. Now, not that any debt isn't hard, not that it's hard to pay off anything, but again, the reality is that not every student is walking out with $100,000 in debt. The number of people I talked to said, well, I can't go to school, it's going to cost $100,000. I have to take out that much debt. That's just not the reality of the situation. Not that you don't take out debt, but not that it's that part. Yeah.
Sorry, on the debt question, and I just saw an article in the Boston Globe about this 2 days ago, but saying similar statistics to what you are, is that the debt is not that great. What frustrates me about a lot of these numbers that are being thrown around in terms of the cost of higher education is that we're just looking at the debt that the students are taking out. And at the federal level, of course, the students are limited in what they can borrow. And there are many, many families out there who are taking on Parent Plus loans to subsidize their students' debt. And they're coming out of their college kids' educational experience with a tremendous amount of debt. And that somehow does not factor into that $1.56 trillion. That is a big number, but it would be a much larger number if you saw what parents were leveraging to try and make sure that their kids got an education. And I think that number needs to be somewhere in this discussion, in my opinion. Sorry.
No, I agree. It's not easily tracked. It's not easily reported, and you don't always have access to it. I did see some good reports, and I hate to quote data that I can't really pull out of my head accurately, but it was that the actual parental borrowing had gone down pretty significantly, and most of the, we'll say, cost of higher education has been pushed onto the students in terms of student debt. So it's not that you actually see an increase in parental debt or borrowing. You actually saw a decrease on that, and parents saying, well, we'll have the students take it out. It's not falling on the parents in the same way. I can't quote the exact statistic, but the trend was that sort of downward, more of a push off to students taking on the debt than parents in the same way. And the numbers, I've seen a couple of the private debt numbers. They're not huge. Not that they're not out there, but they're not as big as you might think they are, as a lot of people think they are. And I wish I could quote them off the top of my head or had done that research before I come out here today to quote it, but I can't remember it right off the top of my head. I can send it to you so you have the articles and some of the data, but it's a little bit different than that. Yeah.
Yeah, and that was my question. Is it in fact part of that number?
This is not going to include all the private debt in the country. It's not easily tracked in the same way, or parental debt in the
Yeah,
same way.
but a parent loan, a plus loan goes through, like here, it's RISLA. So if it's the loan authority, or whether it's MIFA, RISLA, if that's a plus loan, is that what's included in the?
That would be included in there,
Okay,
yes.
then that-
So
that
not
makes
all
things
your
clear.
private borrowing, not all your other
Okay.
statistics. Yeah. And I'll admit I'm not the perfect expert on everything financial aid, so your financial aid office, your financial aid head would be better equipped to answer all of those. But just from pure data that we're able to pull and get on some of that, that's what you'd be looking at there. Yeah. Okay.
Matt, I'm sorry, can I ask a question?
Yes.
This comes from the over at Culinary right now. We're going back to one of your slides. In your looming birth death numbers, were other countries included? Are other countries' numbers growing?
I'm no expert on every country's statistics, but I don't believe so. I believe they're all a bit of a downturn at the moment. Not every country in the entire world. I think there's 195 of them, and I don't know them all off the top of my head. But generally, many of, we say, the sort of developed countries are seeing a bit of those declines in similar ways. And they also don't have as many institutions. They don't have as many students in access-wise going to school in the same way. So it's always hard to use those international models in the same way unless we're thinking of recruitment, and we've seen international on a bit of a decline from international enrollments. Yeah. Okay. Well, let me talk a little bit about student characteristics, and this again has been a part of the fascinating conversation when we think of student expectations, we think about students of the future, and we hear a lot and read a lot, discuss a lot about Generation Z. Current generation of students, like future generation of students, and the characteristics they are bringing to Johnson & Wales and bringing to higher education today. And so we broke out here a little bit of what we're talking about from generational traits of Generation Z. So think about your students, think about the students you're going to be educating soon. Tech-driven, right? These are students that have always had a smartphone for the most part. They've always had constant connection to everything at all times. They might unplug, but they are always hyper-connected. They feel like they're always a part of their network, and they've been digital natives, that at an early age they were learning how to use technology and swipe through different pieces and use touchscreens and tablets and everything else. So always have been digital natives. What I think is interesting, we'll hear a lot about this, very open to sharing, whether they should be sharing, whether they understand the digital imprint that will leave out there of themselves is a whole other story, a whole other question. But they are very quick to share, very quick to put information out there, maybe trying to be the next social media influencer out there that we don't know about. We've heard a lot, and this has come from K-12, from others, saying there's this idea of them as self-educators. Now, I like to always dive in and say what that means, because it doesn't mean that they're going out and doing intense academic research on a given topic. It means that when a question comes up, when they encounter something in course material or class material, what do? I thought it was Google, right? Do you know what it actually is? YouTube, yes. Student focus groups and data will tell you it's actually YouTube that they go to first. They may Google, but Google goes to YouTube. So the instantaneous connection, because they want the 3-minute video that gives them the 3-minute basis of understanding of whatever it was they were encountering. That to me is interesting, right? Because now you have students who are coming to class or coming to the conversation with something. Now, they don't understand necessarily page rankings or how all of that content is created or have the digital information, digital literacy to go through it all, but they are prone to take the first step and seek and ask those questions because they've always had connections to information. They've always had a place that they could go to ask any question possible and typically get some kind of answer about it and dive into it. So there's this question of educating and working with this self-educator mentality of Generation Z. From a competition, from an outreach perspective, when we talk to those in marketing and enrollment management, what they'll tell us is a little bit what's at the bottom here. They expect authenticity in all things, right? Every message has to be authentic. Every message often has to be personalized, right? If I'm growing up in the era of iTunes, of Amazon, of Netflix, of Hulu, of all of where my content comes and everything's personalized and every algorithm sends things directly to me based upon what I've previously done, that's their expectation. Right? You can't just send out generic messages. You can't send out generic materials about Johnson & Wales. They expect it to be tailored and targeted to them. It sets, again, a very high and very expensive bar for marketing communications admissions offices to try to get and meet that expectation. Because if it's not personalized, it's not going to be viewed. It's not going to be looked at. It's not going to be accepted. They have, of course, the acronym many of us know, FOMO, right? The fear of missing out, needing that hyper-connection, needing to always be a part of it, always in the know of what's going on. That's also part of it. You can create that network. You can create that connection. That is very valuable in terms of those students and be a part of this. But I think if we took all this, we started to read articles that would talk about the day in the life of Generation Z. And the more I read this, I thought, well, I'm not that far off from this when I describe it. And think about yourselves, but think about your students and the world they're in, touching 5 or more devices in a day. That can be a smartphone, a tablet, a laptop, a smart TV, an Xbox, a PlayStation, whatever device it's going to be. There's usually 5 or more devices a day, engaging in 3 or more hours of screen time per day. I think that might be low in terms of some recent data we've seen, which we're actually finding is the youngest learners. This is now Generation Alpha. If anybody has followed this, we ran out of letters in the alphabet, so we've gone back to Alpha. These are the youngest learners in elementary school. The screen time numbers actually go up pretty significantly in terms of the hours spent on screens. So we're seeing a lot of hours in screen time. They can surf 2 screens simultaneously. I can't do that. I'm not a multitasker, but certainly when you can see this idea of having many screens. I do get this one, though, expecting an app for everything. All right? Anybody here guilty of this as well? Maybe it's just, yeah, all right. Thank you, people, for being honest. I came up here from New York today, right? I got my tickets for the Long Island Railroad on my phone. I got on my Amtrak train on my phone. I got my Uber here on my phone. I did some banking while I was on the train on my phone. Right? That's where my life basically is run now. And I expect everything to be in there. That's where I expect my world to be. And if we're not going and meeting those students where they are, some people are. Some people are designing those apps, working in that app world for this. Social media savvy at an early age certainly goes to our posting, our constant putting information out there. This one gets a little concerning. The prefer swipe over type. Right? I prefer the graphic user interfaces of the world. I prefer to swipe through things as opposed to typing out papers. The bottom one, this was an acronym I did not know until I started to do some of this research. If you haven't heard it, this is the TLDR. This is the English major in me dying a little bit. That stands for too long didn't read, in case you hear that acronym out there. But it is the sort of Twitter world where everything is done in short snips and short bits and number of limited characters, that the idea of this. Now, I throw this out there because these are the students who are coming into your classrooms that are coming to Johnson & Wales and the future of students with these characteristics, with these expectations. And it's not necessarily saying we have to cater to them completely, but it's about trying to find some middle ground or find ways to reach and educate and work with these students in different ways. And it's those characteristics of the future that many are thinking about, concerned with, trying to plan around as they look at the students of the future here with these characteristics. I also saw that we talk a lot about traditional undergraduate students, but of course we think about non-traditional graduate students, post-traditional students, those that are pursuing more advanced post-bac education or even sort of certificates for their careers. This has been a huge way we start to think about students as this has grown pretty significantly. As schools start to see the downturn in undergraduate students, traditional students, many turn to non-traditional students. Some bucket them in and call working adults, whatever characteristic, whatever title here we would look at. But you're thinking of them as looking at professional masters. They're doing bachelor's degree completion, certificates, standalone courses, and here you're really looking at the desire for online, the desire for accelerated or self-paced programs, evenings and weekends, branch locations, much of what you're doing. But there's the expectation of that we have to go and meet students where they are to actually compete in that marketplace. When I think about program design for all of these students, traditional, post-traditional, graduate, undergraduate, anything, these are some of the building blocks of programs that people have said when we start to think about redesign or design or new launches or the components here that students are looking for in their expectations, these are some of the things that come up most often. We started thinking of them as the building blocks of programs. Not that you have to do all of them for every program, but that students start to look for these pieces. Certainly flexible delivery. We mentioned this already, the growth of online, the growth of hybrid, the desire that maybe I want to take some courses in my dorm room at 2 a.m., maybe I work a full 40-hour work week plus, and then I need to do my courses at night. I require and need that flexible delivery to accommodate my life, to accommodate my lifestyle. At the same time, acceleration, I think, is very important. If we think about this particularly for someone who says, I want to get that next promotion. I want to switch my careers. I don't want you to tell me that I have to wait till next semester to do that. Or you have to tell me that the academic calendar is what's preventing me from getting the promotion or the job that I need. Those students are finding opportunities elsewhere. They're saying, I want something that fits to my schedule. Or if I've got all of this work experience, that I can accelerate through content, why can't I do that? If I can demonstrate mastery or demonstrate my competency in these areas, they say I'm looking for something more along those lines. Middle parts, we'd say there's the desire for stackable credentials. Kind of goes to the comment we had earlier about different parts of coming back for education across a lifetime. People say, well, what if I took a course, and maybe I took a couple courses and it stacked into a certificate? Maybe I took a couple of certificates and that eventually stacked into a degree. I did it at my own pace. I did it in modular function. I paid for it as I went, so I didn't have one massive price tag I took out debt for, but I was able to pay it off as I went. Because that's maybe a new model of how we start to think about this, of a trajectory or a path for a student. I'll say for stackable credentials, they have to be aligned not the way we think that they always should be, but aligned at different points along a career track. There's going to be a certain point. Cybersecurity is a good example of this. We see a lot of cybersecurity programs in these stackable formats, where I can start a career as a cybersecurity analyst or professional without a bachelor's degree. I can do it with an associate's degree, I can do it with certain certificates. At some point though, maybe I'll need that bachelor's degree or some management skills to move up to the next level. Maybe I'll then need some kind of executive coaching program. That may happen 10 years out, it may happen 5 years out. It's not a perfect line and linear path for all of these. It's about finding what part of that stackability meets the desires, the needs of that individual at a certain point in their career path. And trying to align it that way is a little bit of a different way of thinking about it. And then we talk a lot about interdisciplinary pathways. So we have a lot of students that are coming back and saying, well, I started as an English major, that's what I have my bachelor's degree in, but I want to move into computer science. There's some bridge there between those two. I want to find out what that is. I want to make sure that I'm learning all of these different parts that are going to meet my needs. I don't think of it just in terms of academic silos or academic departments the same way. It's more interdisciplinary education. And then the bottom parts to this are very career focused. There's the need, desire for practical experience. How do I apply what I learned? How do I then have something that demonstrates to employer what I learned? And I can come out and I can show you what that looks like through a portfolio, through a co-op, an internship. Or professional development, what does our network look like? What's our network of employers, our network of alums, our network of connections to other institutions even that give me that professional development I need? I lay these out again. These are what we heard over and over again became the building blocks of programs. So the things that would be the distinct value of a program, or the unique differentiator of a program, or just what students were looking for. When it came to exploring my academic opportunities, I would often be looking for these types of parts. That's the bit of mentality of a student, of, again, meeting students where they are of their expectations with the programs that we offer in many ways. What I go to here, I'll skip this one part, is that for all students, we've also seen the rise in terms of mental health services on campus. So this is something that's been a biggest piece of research for our student affairs work at EAB for really the last 5 or 6 years. But this is always the top issue, the top thing that comes up from our research perspective. And it's all about the increase in terms of the utilization of campus mental health and counseling centers. If we actually look at it, some of the data will show us that the counseling center utilization outpaced enrollment growth by about 5 times, meaning students were coming and seeking out mental health counseling on campus at a far greater rate than we are enrolling students. Most of us said that's good. We are very happy that students are proactively and actively coming to us and seeking help when they need it. But it is overwhelming to a lot of campus counseling centers. And we do not have the resources to support students. As again, you dive into why that might be the case or what the situation is for students, of why we've seen that rise, a lot of data research will start to talk about the things over on the right-hand side. There are questions about substance abuse. Certainly always has been an issue, but has continued to rise with opioid crises. We hear about intensified expectations. People would say if we go back to things like No Child Left Behind, if we go to a lot of issues about intense academic expectations of students, social expectations, athletic expectations of students, career expectations of students, there's this intensified focus on what outcomes and what students are going to do. And while many would say that's always been something, everyone would agree that social media has only made it worse. It's only intensified all of these different aspects as students sharing all this information, as how it all feels from the social media part of a lot of it. The political climate certainly continues to be another part of this. We heard a lot of the overwhelming outcomes of 2015, 2016, 2017, 2018, continually the political climate in the country, political outcomes. And one that I think has been a bit fascinating is parenting styles. And lots of questions about parenting styles of our students as they come into college and university. But this highly involved parenting creating busy, overscheduled, failure-averse students who struggle to adapt to challenges as they arise in college. If anybody's read, this has given rise to a new definition of parent. Used to be the helicopter parent, probably all familiar, right? Hovering over all times. Does anybody know what the new term is for parents? It's bulldozer. I've heard a couple. Bulldozer, lawnmower, snowplow, right? Whatever term, I've heard a couple of those, but it's basically that the parent plows down any possible challenge placed in front of their child in advance of this. It takes them all out of the way. That is the new perspective of the parenting approach that we have now that's been a term of note. So all of this is what we say, these are the things that contribute to the rise in terms of demand for mental health counseling. Not that it's not a bad thing that they're seeking out, but we are now somewhat overwhelmed as a campus of how to support these students. What all of this leads to is we think about students and their expectations of success. Right? What does student success mean when we use that term? I first started doing research on student success about 10 years ago at EAB. And when doing that, a lot of what we talked about was what's over on the left-hand side here. Left-hand side, yes. Where you basically talk about access, right? Getting into college was the first part of it. And then it's about, did we retain students from year 1 to year 2? Did we help them make progress towards their degree? And ultimately, did they complete? That was student success. Student success was graduation success. What has happened in the decades since is that there are now all of these other examples, all of these other expectations of a holistic model of student success. Meaning beyond just getting a degree from Johnson & Wales, I expect you to have gotten me the intellectual, social, and emotional development that I need. I expect you to have the post-graduation financial wellness that I expect from the cost of my degree. I expect to be engaged in my career. I put a question mark over on the right-hand side because there are probably new standards against which you're being measured today that we don't even know about yet. But when a student doesn't feel successful in that, they often turn to their alma mater, they turn to a college or university, and they will blame you for not preparing them or not getting them that outcome or that success that they wanted. It's about how do you prepare that world? How do you prepare and make sure that students are successful in all of these different pieces? Because the standard for students is now all of this. This is what I expect from my university degree and my university experience. I'd love to pull up here. This is, again, a relatively quick overview and a high-level overview of what we're discussing, what we're hearing about for the students of the future, the students that we're educating, enrolling, supporting. Questions or reactions to this of students that you've seen here at Johnson & Wales, general reactions or questions about this, things that even maybe we haven't included in here that you have found coming to your offices, to your classrooms, that have been a bit different about students. So questions, reactions to this section. What do you think? Okay, hand in the back there. All the way back half.
There are a lot of major problems in the world. I'm just wondering about the connection between education and some of the major identified problems in the world.
Wow. So the question, I know for those on, there are some major problems in the world, and the question is about the connection between the major problems in the world and education. I don't even know where to start. I don't, right? That's the good question. That kind of gets me to the last section of this. I don't want to just jump with it necessarily, but it's the question of what does education do? What are the outcomes of education? What are the positive things that come from education? Because I don't even know which specific one you'd want to dive into of what that is. So I'm not going to get on a soapbox. I'm not going to wax on that one. I'll just say, I don't know. What do you think?
The United States contains about, you hear between 4 and 6 or 7% of the people in the world. Food systems would be one example of a problem. Water and food and climate. These are just examples. Environment. According to a survey by the AAC&U, one of the most important things we look for, employers look for, is people who are educated to be able to solve problems with people whose views are different from their own. Mm-hmm. So just, could you speak to that a little bit?
Sure. Well, I'm no science expert, I'm no climate expert, I'm no water expert by any stretch of the imagination because I've researched education for a long time. I think one, we don't get a lot of great credit for research done on a lot of those areas that try to solve those major crises and major issues around the country. The ones that do are usually nonprofits doing some of that work with better PR campaigns and have a better narrative they tend to tell as opposed to academic researchers. So I know I've seen that from the research side that I don't think we necessarily in higher education tell the best narrative or story about the great research outcomes to a lot of those. So that's the way I'd kind of run at that one. To general other things of social and communication and understanding perspectives and others, I think that there's a lot of critiques about that. I think when you start to get to the critiques of higher education, it's the questions of you sort of read about this in the press, the questions of are they welcoming environments for everybody? Are we having that open discussion? Are we creating that environment? I believe it is, personally, but I think you have to, again, go against what is the media debate and the story that's out there about higher education and questions of speech on campus, et cetera, and all the things that go on. So I don't think there's, again, a perfect answer to it. I can talk about it a little bit, but yeah, there's no right answer to that. I think opportunity is there. I think universities do have and sit at that nexus, that opportunity to create those positive outcomes. I don't think we're necessarily telling the right stories about it, or talking about it, or making people aware of it the same way. And for me, that's really why you start to have this debate, right? The crisis of confidence piece, which is feeling like college is a lousy investment, both on a private and a public perspective. Right? This is what you read about. This was one of those cover articles, maybe I saw this from Newsweek, goes out and starts calling college a lousy investment. Students that took out a lot of debt, that money was being spent on frivolous research done by faculty members, right? Anybody ever see the shrimp on a treadmill video? Right? Go Google shrimp on a treadmill. It basically is a faculty member at a university that was putting a shrimp on a treadmill. And people said that was how we were spending money. Right? That's where my tuition dollars went to. It didn't talk about studying ocean life and the effects of environment on ocean life and everything else. But it was that easy media story that you started to see. And I quote those because they were from 2012. This article is from 2012. I like to call it out because I was talking about this in 2012. And in 2013 and 14 and 15 and 16 and 17 and 18 and 2019, we've been talking about that constant drumbeat of critiques against higher education. And we have not seen the greatest arguments against it. We haven't seen a drastic change in the narrative. Many people will point to these pieces, right? These are the completion rates in the country. I mentioned these earlier. It's really easy to look at a flat line up at the top. This is the 6-year graduation rate for 4-year institutions up at the top. Hovers right around 60%. And if you put this back another 10 years and another 10 years, it would still be about 60% in terms of completion. And you say that means a large portion of students are enrolling in higher education and not completing. The bottom line, that's the 3-year graduation rate for 2-year institutions. Equally flat, much lower, even in those cases. And so we talk about the student loan debt, we talk about the rising costs. It's a very easy argument to make, right, about why there's not value in a college degree or what the costs are and why this is a negative in so many ways. Just some recent data, I've just drawn this up, and there's some surveys again that we're doing that start to look at the overall public perception of higher education. If you actually start to look at this, coming out from 2012 to 2019, this is among all adults saying college and universities positively or negatively affect the US. If you really look at these numbers from, again, 2015, 2017, 2019, the negative has continued to grow and the positive has gone down. So even despite the positive things that we could argue colleges and universities do, the perception, the public perception of this continues to be on that negative downward trend, despite all of it. And we're not telling, again, that narrative piece. Now, it's not exactly the same way, but a lot of public institutions would feel this from a public funding perspective. What you're looking at here, these are the numbers that go from basically 2008 to 2017, and this is the changes in per student state spending. So this is, again, public funding of higher education, state by state across the country. I think you can notice pretty clearly, almost all of them are in a very negative place, and a negative perspective. Even those that have increased across that time frame, they are not back to pre-recession levels of per student state funding, despite increases in a lot of these categories. Because the public perception, again, is that, and that flows into public funding. That has gone away from higher education, has gone away from the positive aspects of a lot of this. There are, again, other media stories you see, a lot of media arguments about this. I always quote a couple of these over on the left-hand side. It's the constant attack against liberal arts and higher education. Since we're the liberal arts major, you hear a lot of these. It's always the question you get. I quote this one over on the left-hand side. This is the governor of Kentucky, Matt Bevin, who's created the program Work Ready Kentucky, that was quoted many, many times saying something along these lines, but find entire parts of your campus that don't need to be there, that are not helping to produce the 21st century educated workforce. If you're studying interpretive dance, God bless you, but there's not a lot of jobs right now in America looking for people with that as a skill set. All right? You'll hear this, right? Political rhetoric all the time. Now, I do love to quote, Matt Bevin has a BA in East Asian Studies from Washington and Lee University. So you have to kind of throw that one out there too, of skills that you get from that. But that's a lot of what, again, the critiques are. People say even the term liberal arts is a branding disaster. It's got a negative perspective about it right now. That even overcoming that is a big challenge to it. So we hear this over and over and over again, this constant critique of higher education. What I think you don't hear all the time are the positives, right? That's what we talk a lot about. And I mentioned this earlier, that higher education is pretty well positioned here to create the next part of our workforce, or the future of the country. That you're prepared and you're creating students for the learning economy. That you teach students how to have this constant need for skill acquisition and information. The idea of understanding silos of knowledge that are less relevant. You can connect different parts of this. You can connect different parts of an industry, understanding the broader category of all this. Knowing networks for individuals and organizations, of understanding the network of the university and study and research, et cetera. And so a lot of this is saying the new strategies are, how do we think about learning how to learn? How do we kind of take the approach of applying knowledge as opposed to just being specific in one skill area? Lifelong education is something you do where you bring students in and out of education across a lifetime and constantly upskilling, or the need for new skills as industries change. And again, thinking about the networks in higher education. You're primed with the networks of employers, of organizations, of individuals, of alums, of other institutions in the country. Trying to make sure that we use those networks to the benefit of our students, the benefit of the economy, the better of society, the better of our communities. All those things are what universities already do. We just don't get a lot of credit for it, nor necessarily focus on it in the same ways. But that's a lot of the shift that people are talking about and want to know about. I mentioned T-shaped professionals. I won't talk about them too much because I want to get to this last part, that if we round out one easy argument about the value of a college degree, people always go to salary, they always go to the quantitative outcomes of a college degree. That's what we look at too. Often many will look at the widening gap here in terms of median annual earnings among full-time workers aged 25 to 32, that's the data set you're looking at here, where the gap between a bachelor's degree holder and an associate's degree holder or a high school diploma holder has actually never been wider than it is today. There's that very basic salary outcome that people don't quote enough or don't talk enough about necessarily, or the $1 million lifetime earning differential between a bachelor's degree and a high school diploma. I can tell you the number of conversations I've had with high school counselors that don't know this data, don't talk about this data to students in high school about college outcomes is phenomenal. And it's the one that's put out there most often that people can easily quote. The ones at the bottom start to come out as well. This is the 47%, almost 50% increase in terms of the likelihood of having health insurance through employment by having a bachelor's degree. The likelihood of having a retirement plan goes up significantly. The likelihood of reporting your health to be very good or excellent goes up significantly. The likelihood of owning a home, the likelihood of running your own business, the likelihood of having a family, all of these positive outcomes go up, the likelihood goes up significantly by having a college education and a college degree. But we're not, again, telling that story. We're not talking about those outcomes in the same way. We're just constantly responding to, it costs too much, students aren't completing, that drumbeat, again, of critiques we've been hearing for a long time. We'd like to see that change. We'd like to see the industry as a whole be able to better combat that narrative and talk about it. But I can tell you, in 7 years of talking about it, it has only gotten worse for higher education, despite outcomes being good and getting better in many ways. So it's about, again, shifting that narrative that we see in higher education. All of this, again, was to try to give you the overview of the entire higher education industry, everything that we are hearing at EAB in roughly 90 minutes of time. So planning for the next 10 years of Johnson & Wales, thinking about the future of the industry. And the goal was to cover the sustainability of the business model, student enrollments, demographics, talk a little bit about students and give you a perspective of what we will see from students enrolling in the future and currently enrolled. And lastly, just again, that negative perception that continues to be a part of the higher education industry. Now, my goal here is to say these are the things to plan around. These are the things to think about and be aware of and not just ignore them. Right? I think that's a big challenge, is that many people say this is not the rosiest presentation I've ever seen. It's not, but it's the reality of what I've heard for the last year and a half from colleges and universities, that if they are going to be sustainable, succeed for the next 10 years, they say not just survive, but thrive. It's about planning around these aspects, planning around these challenges for the future. And that's why I wanted to share them with you today. I will gladly pull up for questions, comments, and reactions to this. I will give the plug in case anyone has to run out. We'll send out anything digital you like, any of the research that goes behind any of this, and give a plug that all of our research at EAB is driven by our member feedback. So you do have feedback forms that if you have questions, other parts you'd like, please do take time to fill those out before you duck out the door or head on to your next session here today. But I'll pull up here with questions, comments, reactions. We have one in the middle there, yeah. We're going to try and get you a microphone right behind you.
Thank you. It was very, very fascinating data you shared with us. A question regarding the data that we just saw about the impact of degree earnings and potential for degree and benefit scales with a degree. Do you feel that it is pertinent and even critical for colleges and universities to market themselves by emphasizing the capacity of a university to create opportunity, either through their networks, their alumni networks, through relationships with industry, these kind of things? Do you think that that is critical, not maybe only to students, prospective students, but also to parents?
I would say yes. I think it is important. I think if you look at a network and you think of the value of a college experience, that network is important. The network of alums, the network of employers, the network of community organizations, the network, that's a huge part of it. And you have those relationships. I think I find many universities don't necessarily always know the relationships that faculty members have with organizations or individuals or other parts of it. It's about trying to map that out and understand it and use it as a value, or again, a differentiator in a market. Is that relationship that you have, or is that network that you have, that a student can understand, well, coming to Johnson & Wales gets me access to that network in a different way. When we think of the social media networks that people want to be a part of, or that fear of missing out in some ways, there's a connection psychologically to that I want to be a part of that network because I see the benefits of it, or I feel it's got something to me that is a benefit. So I think it's important. I think it's going to continue to be a differentiator for many schools. That it's also a differentiator if you don't have the network. It's going to be something that helps you in a negative way. It's going to be a losing out to others that do promote and enhance the networks that they have. That's opinion. I mean, it's not database necessarily, but I certainly think from what I've seen, it's going to be important. Oh, sure.
I think it would come under retention, but I've read a few articles on how students feel like they come in second sometimes to schools putting pressure on faculty to get published, to go give presentations, to go do other things besides teach students.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering if there was any connection to that retention of teachers having to deal with the business of education instead of educating.
So I'll think about it from the perspective, I don't think I've seen it as a retention challenge necessarily. If you're thinking about faculty retention at an institution, I don't think I've seen it or seen articles or data. I've heard some stories here and there about it, of the overwhelming managerial tasks or everything else that goes into the faculty role, where you want to teach, you want to do research, you want to do the things that you have prepared and built a career out of, those specialization areas. And now it's just, there's so much more to it, right? There's the counseling of students, there's the career guidance, there's the networking parts of it. What I would say is we've seen a lot of institutions moving towards more specialized faculty roles, is the best way to put it. And I've seen different institutions of all different shapes and sizes move to more research-heavy faculty, teaching-heavy faculty, full-time faculty, non-tenured that are on long-term contracts to do teaching, all of those sort of new roles of faculty. And it's one of those big questions that I've not seen anybody run out to answer, but I've kind of thrown it out there with our members, which is, what is the future role of the faculty? Right? If we think 10 years out, what does a faculty member do? What are their expectations? What are they supposed to be prepared for in many ways? And I've never gotten a great answer about it, to be quite honest. It's a challenging thing to run at or even address. It's sort of the elephant in the room question about the future. For me, is what will the faculty role look like? And I don't know. But we've seen those specializations as the big move by a lot of schools to say, have faculty that focus on teaching, They're often those that are the best with students. They have long-term contracts. They don't necessarily have to do research in the same way. It's been a little bit of that specialization we've seen from all different types. But. Yeah, in the back, go ahead.
Matt, first of all, great presentation. I think there's a lot of great things that are that you presented to us today. One question I have, I guess maybe it's probably at the 30,000 foot level a little bit, but your presentation is talking about higher education in general. But what I'm seeing, and maybe maybe I could be wrong in this, but it's some of the stuff I've been reading, and I'm just wondering if you're hearing any of this. Some of the think tanks and some of the things that are happening in this country, some of the perceptions are about our economy in general, the way we put such a premium on higher education, that what we're doing is we're leaving behind 80% of the K through 9 population. And I think that's one big concern that I don't think, I mean, that's why my question to this is like, how do you feel this fits in the context of the fact that there's a lot of people that believe that K through 12 education has to change in addition to higher ed? Because I think that from what I can see, you look at your statistics where we put all this emphasis in getting kids into college and the cost of it, et cetera, and yet the government, federal, state, local, have divested in the educational process. Mm-hmm. And you'll have industries like the HVAC industry, which right now have 150,000 jobs that pay between $80,000 and $140,000 a year. They can't fill them. And so the question becomes, how do we serve these needs in general? And are you hearing any discussions about this? The whole enchilada of education has to shift its focus from an economic model that's been based on consumption to one that now has to go back and looking at our institutions and really shoring up families, communities, because quite frankly, this last recession has hammered the middle class. And I think that's something that we in the Northeast here, I spent time, for example, many years ago, teaching in a high school system where 5% of the graduates went on to college. Most of them went to work in a coal mine, or they went to work for the Arrow shirt factory down the street. And that world has gone away, and it hasn't been replaced by anything. And that's a large part of our population in the middle sections. You could see it on your map there early on.
I like that. I may use that whole enchilada of education phrase, because I think that's what I run into a lot, is the disconnect of education that I find. That you've got higher education, you have colleges and universities, and you have K-12 in all its different shapes and forms. And there's not a lot of the connection between those two. And that's what I think has been more interesting as I've seen our work at EAB start to work with public K-12 and higher education, is just how little they connect with each other, of that holistic idea of education. And that's what I've talked a lot about for many years now, is trying to see the better connections to that. Because the time that I've spent in K-12 systems is trying to educate teachers, counselors, psychologists, everybody's working with students about what could be a part of their future, what opportunities are out there, what it means to get a college degree, or how to navigate financial aid, how to apply all those things. There's a great Chicago public school study that tracked students who were high-performing students, had the ability to go to college, had good GPAs, good performance, and sort of tracked the fall off of them not going to school because of either problems navigating the application process, not understanding the finance process, family problems, again, all the things that happen to a student along that pathway from 8th grade through what could be enrollment in higher education. And it's just phenomenal to realize there's not one perfect answer. It's that it's unique for every student. And very much the way we think about student success is, what is the right resource or the right intervention for the right student at the right time that could help them or be supportive of them? I would say that, honestly, the era of big data, right, the era of data analytics has not spilled over into K-12 the way we've started to see it in higher education, of trying to help and work with students and get them what they need and know a bit more information about them. It's a challenging, it's a lot of debate about that, of trying to track a lot of data. But we're starting to see a little bit more of it. I just have not seen that massive connection between higher ed and K-12 that I'd really like to see, quite frankly. You'd like to see more of that. So again, no perfect answer there of what it will look like. Individual districts have done it. Some states have focused on it a lot more, of having that college career exploration piece as a part of their ESSA plans early on, but it's not universal across the country or every district that you start to see. Okay. If you do have other questions, please don't hesitate to let me know. I'll be here to answer them. But otherwise, thank you very much.
Given us a lot to think about this afternoon, and so hopefully we'll be able to continue this dialogue. But again, one more time, help me thank Matt for his wonderful presentation this afternoon.
Thank you.